Well, here's a 2-hour conversation of modesty that you didn't know you needed, but you absolutely need. So welcome to the Always Hope podcast. This is Dr. Mark Sakasa, licensed marriage and family therapist, and grateful to be sharing another amazing episode of the podcast with you today. Well, in today's episode, I welcome back Dr. Sarah Denny Lorio, bioethicist and speaker, to talk us through an incredibly nuanced discussion on modesty. Listen, I had no idea that this would be as contentious of an issue, but I'm grateful to have had Sarah so that we can talk about this in a way a little bit differently than the standard Catholic flair. So, what is modesty? And is the responsibility on women to watch how they dress? Does the responsibility fall more on men to watch how they think about women? Why do we even care about modesty in today's day and age? And what is that line between personal responsibility, freedom, and modesty? We get into it all in this conversation. So keep your AirPods charged and ready to go for this epic return of Dr. Sarah Denny. Dr. Sarah Denny Lorio. I'm going to say that this time. It's great. Welcome back to the Always Hope podcast. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Mara. Thank you for having me back. It's wild that it's been 3 years since I was last on here.
3 years. Yeah, I think we're on like a 3-year interval. It was like 3 years the first time.
Then
3 years the second time.
Oh,
and
perfect.
now 3 years the third time.
So I'm signed up for 2027.
Yeah. Let's
Looking
make it happen. Let's get it on right now. Yeah, exactly. It's so funny. So some changes in your life before we even kind of jump in, like you got married recently.
Yeah. So since the last podcast.
How's that?
Yeah, I got married, which is amazing. Everyone's like, how is marriage? And my quick response is everyone should do it. If you feel called to it, obviously. But I love it. I'm very blessed because I'm married to an incredible man, and the Lord just really gave us the gift of right timing. Our story was really beautiful. We actually knew each other and dated when we were seniors in high school, went our separate ways.
Oh my goodness.
Lived our separate lives. And then, I was coaching cross country, as was he. And we literally ran into each other on the cross country course while I was chasing one of my girls.
This sounds like a rom-com.
I know.
This is a rom-com.
A lot of people have said, and I'm like, I'll take it, sure. But yeah, so it was really beautiful because when we recorded the previous episode, that was about 9 months before I defended my dissertation. And the Lord just thing after thing after thing. It's not like it's all rainbows and butterflies, but it was the fulfillment of a lot of promises that came through a lot of waiting and a lot of perseverance. And, to all the women out there, the struggles with hope, but this is the Always Hope podcast. And I just feel like the Lord really, I feel like our story, my husband's name is Alex. Alex and I's story is not just for us. It is also a real seed of encouragement for a lot of people that we're blessed to interact with, that the Lord, he's always on the move, especially in ways that we cannot see.
Amen to that. Yeah, I just watched It's a Wonderful Life recently. It's my
gosh.
favorite Christmas movie of all time.
Same,
and
me too.
I think that's the moral of that story. That's the moral of that story is, at the end, you don't realize how the Lord is operating in your life. And sometimes the angel who feigns suicide for you to get out of yourself to go jump into the water is the Lord working.
Amen. I love that movie. I love that you just brought that up. I'm not even kidding. I might have been looking up in New Orleans. We have that old one screen theater, Britannia Theater. I don't know if you remember that.
Yeah.
But they show It's a Wonderful Life every December. So just before I jumped on this episode,
awesome.
I was looking up the showtime. So, confirmation. Guess I should go for the 35th year in a row.
There it is.
I'll take it.
Oh, it's so good.
Yeah.
It's so good. Well, thank you for sharing. So, just even as you're talking, we're easing into this conversation today, Sarah, but you said that the story between you and Alex is something worth sharing. What aspect of it do you want to share with our listeners?
Yeah, I would say, from an external perspective, as I move through my 20s, and this is also a testament to my personality. So for better or worse, I'm definitely someone who, I'm going to be put together. That's how I was raised, but it's also just that's my comfort level, and I think partially even in my education, I got my master's at a seminary. So I was one woman amongst many men, and there were some other women studying. We were all in different classes, but it was an experience, to say the least. Many blessings, but also many frustrations, as it should be. It was a gift of a time because the Lord, I feel like it was a very sacred space to walk into, and it gave me an extra layer of insight, if that makes sense, into the psychology of man.
Yep.
And a lot of mercy, you know, like to realize the humanity of these men discerning the priesthood and those that continue on that vocational path. But, you know, in those years, I remember just feeling in a particular way, because people would make comments. So for those who are Catholic, they might be familiar with this. If you're in your young to mid 20s and you go to daily mass at any point, like even once in a blue moon, there's probably some old sweet lady who's going to be like, oh, you would make a great nun, you know? And you're like, oh,
yeah, right.
Thank you. And it really is a compliment in some way, you know? It really, it is.
It absolutely is.
But I remember the Lord in those years, he put on my heart in a very particular way. I was open to religious life, but at the age of 20, he very clearly in prayer one day, and I'm not a mystic, so obviously it wasn't an audible voice, you know, but I had this sense like I'd never had before, and probably since, where the Lord very clearly asked me if I would be open to receiving the gift of a husband. Because I, in my very intense athletic personality, I'm like, well, if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it to the nth degree. You know, if you say run 2 miles, like, okay, let's run 5. So I, for a while, and because of the circle I was in certain ways, it's really healthy because you're sort of surrounded by these things. In other ways, maybe we can be a bit more extreme about it and overthink it. But I was very open to religious life, and I saw the beauty of it. And I thought if I loved the Lord, I had to give him everything, which we do. But I thought that must look like objectively, well, if I give him every single thing I desire in the form of religious life. And so the Lord really sort of right-sided up, if that makes sense. Like he righted that and made it more of what I think is authentic truth, which is it's where his call and my desires and how he's created me all converge into one, you know? But that was when I was 20, and my now husband, when we were 18, the week before college, he broke up with me. We went our separate ways. So he wasn't in the picture. Like we were friends, but it wasn't in a romantic setting. And so from that word at 20 to the gift of receiving my vocation when I was 34, that's a lot of time, you know? And so I think
it's a long time.
It is.
Yeah.
And I think there's multiple pieces to this. And I would say one, and I know there's a lot we could talk about, but I'll keep it to this. Number one, for those who feel like the Lord has been very clear with them and they're tempted to doubt, especially when other people volunteer to them, like, oh, well, maybe you're wrong, and maybe your standards are too high, and maybe like you're not doing enough. Like you need to put yourself out there. I'm not saying you don't put yourself out there. Obviously you do. But I think there's this space of, number one, you're never going to do it perfectly. So some days I was like, oh my gosh, the Lord's going to provide for me. I'm going to be fine. And some days I was like, where the heck are you, Jesus? Like, this is ridiculous, you know? And there were seasons that were more difficult than others. And I like to tell even the girls that I would work with, like, I'm not saying that you're going to have to wait till 34. Most of you probably aren't, because it's not, I wouldn't say that's the typical call. But I knew in my life, the Lord made very clear that the work he invited me to, even through my PhD and my dissertation, if you had given me a choice between getting married, having children, or writing my dissertation, I would have very quickly chosen. In the beginning, I may have been like, I don't know. But while I was writing the dissertation, like the death to self, the dissertation is, I would have been like, if I had a baby on my lap right now, I would be like, forget this, you know? And so in a certain way, in objective circumstances, the Lord really made that's how he makes our paths clear to us, you know? But it was also through that experience, you know, people sometimes, I remember a friend of mine, we weren't super close, but I remember him asking me how the dissertation writing was going. And I was like, honestly, it's the most difficult thing I've ever done, which is saying something. And if God wasn't real, I don't think I could finish it. And he started laughing. He was like, oh my gosh, you're being so dramatic. And I was like, no, I'm not being dramatic right now. And I realize you can't understand my interior, but I'm just going to leave you with that. I was telling you the 100% truth. But now that I look back, Mario, and I see the woman that I am and the path that he's forged, not just for me or through me, but like inside of me. I don't know how other than it's like a deep internal reality. The woman that came out of, it's like I birthed in a sense this dissertation, but it's like the dissertation birthed me. I don't know how to explain that other than that's like the image I have of. So when I came in on the other side, the woman that I was, you know, who right about to finish it was just being faithful to where I feel like the Lord was calling me. I was showing up to my life I honestly, I did the dating app thing for like a month because I felt like I quote should, because it's not my personality, and it totally works for some people. And I think it's great if that's what you feel called to, but I didn't. But I was like, let me just do it so I can tell everyone to leave me alone. And then I got on it and it was everything I thought it would be. And then I happily gave it a try and got off of it after a month. I was like, oh, I came, I saw, I'm good. Bye. And then within that same exact time frame, the Lord very clearly convicted me of the fact that if I was willing to be so open to these men that I had never met, and yet I kept having these run-ins every single weekend with this man that I knew to be good, but our stories had no longer been intertwined, so I didn't know how he was or what was up with him, It just, the Lord called me to a certain courage and vulnerability to be like, hey, because he had always been the one previously, the tables had flipped, and years before he was very open to more, and I was like, I just wasn't interested. But we had such a great respect and friendship that it had to be a very clear line when I said, I do not think we should keep speaking because it's not fair to you and it's not fair to me. And so we didn't see or talk to each other for 5 years. And then the Lord in his humorous, but that's why it really is a rom-com. Like the Lord in his humorous way, we just kept running into each other.
I know this is not at all what we're going to be talking about, but this is great.
Sorry, I don't want to talk too much.
But no, it's wonderful. No, it's fine. We have all the time in the world here because I know people are listening and are interested in this.
Yeah.
When you said like you guys kind of knew each other for those 14 years, 16 years in between, 18 breaking up and then 34 getting married.
Yeah.
There was on and off conversations about that. What in the end finally like shifted your heart to say, let me actually start dating this guy as opposed to just putting up a Heisman Trophy, stiff arm.
Well, I had put up the Heisman Trophy stiff arm. I think that's what's crazy is there was a season where the Heisman Trophy stiff arm was appropriate. And if you ask him now,
yes,
he will say, you did for us what was the best thing you could have done. He's like, I'm so grateful that you said, like, I respect you. I love you dearly as a friend. It was like, I had this image in my mind the day that we had this conversation. Actually, I remember it was the first Sunday of Advent. So I was like, liturgical New Year. Here's a change. But it was like that there was this beautiful gift I'd had, but I felt like I was supposed to close the door. But there was a hallway I was supposed to walk down away from that door. And I told him, I remember telling him, I'm not angry. I'm not upset. We have such a gift of friendship. I'm not like slamming it. Like I'm mad. I'm not like bitter. I can't explain it, but it was a particular detachment because my heart felt called in other areas to be open to other people. And so I said, as grateful as I am for this, I know it's not fair to you or to me. I can't be 100% free, neither can you. So I'm closing this door. And I'm open to whatever the Lord wants to do. But I literally said, I do not foresee it being you. Like I wanted to be honest to allow him to be free. Because in my mind, it was. And at that time, it was not. Do you know what I mean? Like time is so wild to me. It's such a part of our story because it wasn't. And then 4 to 5 years later, we run back into each other. I have no other way to explain it other than, again, it was that dating app. In a sense, the Lord used that experience, like these different conversations I was having, or conversation. I put them in quotes, but the experience I was having that the Lord was reminding me, you can never reach the end of a person. And I realized that there was this man that when I'm running into him at a cross country meet, he still knows me and I know him better than most people I've met in the meantime, if that makes sense. And I knew that there was still this beautiful friendship there. And I really think it was the Lord. There was a space where the Lord really put it on my heart. You know what happened? Actually, this is so funny. I know exactly what happened. So a coworker, something had happened with one of our students, unfortunately a tragedy. And so I was teaching seniors and sophomores, and he was teaching seniors and sophomores. And this was after one of the hurricanes. And unfortunately, one of the students had overdosed. And so I teach at an all-girls Catholic high school. He teaches at the brother school, so the all-boys Catholic high school. And so some of my girls, the seniors, were friends with some of his boys. And my coworker, the campus minister at Chappelle, where I taught, was like, hey, you should really call Alex Lorio at Rummel and talk to him about it because he's going to have the most information for you. And I remember leaving her classroom like, really, Jesus? Like the last person, like, it's just easier. I'm like, why do I have to call Alex? Like anybody else, So I called him. And I was in a season, and people who've heard my story at different points would hear this. I was honestly in a season where I thought all Catholic men were idiots. And I was like, I want to marry a Protestant.
Hey.
I know.
Hey,
and they're not. They're so not. But
We're
the
not.
ones that
We're
I had
not.
been around.
As a Catholic man, I will
Yeah,
I will vouch.
obviously.
that
And
we're
I
not
married
all
a great
idiots.
Catholic man. But I was in a season of like I had to really
Bitterness.
heal
I
from
get it.
bitterness. Yeah. So
Yeah.
So I knew Alex was not the type of guy, but what that meant is in our conversations, I was able to be completely myself and just share. Like we ended up just catching up after we talked about all these other things. And we're talking about cross country because we're both coaching at the time, which is why we're seeing each other every weekend. And I was just explaining, my dissertation, which led me to connect back to, because Margaret Sanger had similar frustrations with men in the church. So I was explaining like, gosh, like she's looking more and more like my friend sometimes, which is surprising me, And I remember thinking, wow, this is wild. Like he wasn't defensive. He wasn't correcting me. He was just letting me explain where I was. And at the end of that conversation, like this sounds crazy, but it very naturally came up because of the research I was doing. Somehow love and responsibility came up because of, again, what I was writing. And I remember at the end of that conversation, I just very honestly told him, and actually this kind of connects to modesty, which perhaps it's a great transition, but we had talked for longer than I talked to anybody on the phone. So i.e. over an hour by far. And I realized we've been talking about love and responsibility for about 10 or 20 minutes. And all of a sudden I was like, Alex, look, this was a great conversation, but we're in our 30s. I'm not doing this thing where like we talk about really intimate topics, which is going to open up one or both of our hearts if we're not dating. So like, I'm just letting you know, this was great. This is not your fault because I'm the one that I think probably brought it up. I was like, but I don't want to do this thing where we just like dance around intimate topics and we're just friends. And he was like, nope, I totally get it. I respect that. Thank you for being honest. And I was like, okay, great. And then we finished talking about what we started talking about, and that was it. It was great. Awesome. We went our separate ways. But after that conversation, I realized that everything we talked about highlighted the gift of friendship that remained, And so it like highlighted for me, oh, this man that I discerned before, I did not feel called to marry. I was not interested in a romantic sense. Suddenly, and I really chalk that up to the Holy Spirit. It was like suddenly I was a different woman, right? Coming through what I'd walked and lived. He was a different man. And I was like, wait, I know him, but I don't know him. And I want to get to know him more. And so I just offered that in a very honest, vulnerable conversation. I was like, wow. Remember that one time I was like, you don't ask me this question again. I mean, and really, I didn't know. I was like, hey, so I just want to let you know that somehow the door popped back up in the hallway. So I'm willing to open it up. Yeah. Also, I have no idea if you're dating someone. So if you are, let's just acknowledge that and I will move on and we'll be good.
Forget the conversation.
And
yeah.
He wasn't, and we started dating. And because of that, the Lord, I mean, I didn't have a lot of emotional
that's great.
Space till the dissertation was finished. But again, he's the most patient man I've met. So it worked. But then when we were in a space, I finished the defense. We had time to like really like discern it even more seriously, if that makes sense. That was one of the main things I could fit into my heart at that time after I finished the PhD. Then within 7 to 9 months, then we were engaged, and here we are, over a year married. And
incredible.
It's one of the most incredible. It is the greatest gift I've been given, for sure. And all because of God's right timing.
Amen to that. Yeah. I thought you were going to say that you saw him, like what changed is that you were out on the cross country races and you saw him in those 5-inch shorts for the first time or something, as like a coach.
Mario, you want to know what happened? First of all, I wish you could hear.
You're like, that was it. I was like, no, it was that he talked love and responsibility to me.
That's my love language. No,
that's my love language.
Funny because
talk JP2 to me, baby.
Yeah. He makes so much fun. I probably shouldn't say that, but just the way that cross country uniforms has changed. He's like, what are these guys doing? This is ridiculous. But actually, our students. So the Lord gave us a grace that nobody knew we were dating for a while, and we chose that as much as possible, just because we know the whole world, especially our students. But the one time I walked up to him. This might have been the same day that we had this conversation later in the day. And I was like, you know what? This is stupid. We're friends. I'm just going to go tell him bye. And I went to go tell him bye, which meant his Rummel students just heard me say something about fantasy football and I don't know, something else. It was like a 45-second conversation. And I walked away and I was like, oh, shoot, I forget high school boys. They were like, Coach Lorio, she loves Jesus. She loves sports. She loves cross country. she's perfect for you. You know, he's like, oh, you guys have no idea. Like,
That's so funny.
Cheers to Alex
That's so
Lorio,
funny.
and here we are.
Cheers. Cheers. That's fantastic. Well, yeah, thanks for sharing that. That's just great because our episode that we did 3 years ago is my most listened to episode. So a lot of folks have been listening to that episode. I just re-released it since I put the show on YouTube. I wanted to make sure that that one was one of the ones that's on my YouTube channel. So I re-released that just recently. And I'm sure people would love to hear kind of where you've been in between these 3 years. But then also just since I do so much in the dating space that I know a lot of folks who are listening are in a situation that you just spoke about, which is that they're single, they're trying to find the one, they're trying to figure this out, and people are frustrated by that. But then also just that question of longing and expectation, like you spoke about, are just themes that I know my listeners are connecting with. So thanks for just being vulnerable with us and taking a few minutes just to share all of that before we jump into whatever else we're about to talk about.
Yeah. Well, and if I can share one like closing point too with your listeners on that, what you just shared, you don't have to force it. Like 10 years previously was not the time for my husband and I, and he was a great man, I was a great woman, but it was not the time. And people would ask me, you know, people do that in circles, like, isn't that a great guy? Why don't you date him? And it was a really unfair position at times for me to be in, but also it's like I couldn't deny my heart and I wasn't at peace. And the reality is that was the Lord, you know, like, so you don't have to force it. Whereas fast forward 10 years when it was right. I mean, don't, you know, mistake me. I definitely was like, oh shoot, Lord, do I really want to get into this? Like, this is, I thought I discerned this, you know, like, do I want to open this door? But there was always a space in which, even when it was difficult and the discernment was hard, we allowed the questions to be there, right? Like, because dating is the discernment where you're like, I don't know, but I'm willing to try. And so just know that you don't have to force, but when it is right, it's just so much less drama than when you try to force the wrong person or the wrong timing, and to have a lot of hope in that.
Yeah. Well said. Great. Thanks, Sarah.
Absolutely. Thanks for letting me share.
That's the right way to button that up.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. So let's shift gears here for a little bit. Okay.
Yeah.
Recap for us. Okay. Freedom. Okay. What I want to talk about today is the virtue of modesty. And I think that so much of the conversation, as you and I have discussed before, just lacks nuance. And we don't want to step into this blaming anybody or judging or anything, but we really just want to kind of dive deeper into, well, what does the church really teach about this? And I'll say, for context for people, the reason that I wanted to have this conversation was a couple years ago, I went on a cruise with my family for the first time. And it was great. It was my dad's 80th birthday, and he wanted to do something big where it was all his kids, all the grandkids got together. And this is what he wanted for his birthday, was for all of us to be together doing this cruise for him, which was just awesome. And so we went on this cruise 2 years ago. It was phenomenal, great time. But it was one of those moments where I realized, I think I've been under a rock for the last 10 years. Like, I just didn't realize, like, I consider myself somebody who kind of at least knows what's happening within the world. I keep up with technology. I have teenagers, so I keep up with music. Like, I know what movies are coming out. But there were certain trends that I missed something. I missed something. And what I had missed was, I didn't realize on one day when the sun finally came out on the cruise, first couple of days were wet and rainy. And then when the sun comes out, we go up to the pool deck and we're walking around. And I was like, oh, wow. Okay. All right. Something has shifted culturally, where the norm wasn't even just bikinis, but it was specifically string or thong bikinis. And that was the norm. Like, that was the norm. It wasn't just isolated one woman or another. Like, that was just the norm. And I was like, okay, wow. All right. I've missed something here. I didn't realize that this is now what is considered normal, for bathing suit attire. And it just got me really thinking, in light of, I guess, the conversations we've had about freedom and women's freedom, that how are we here? Like, how is this now being seen as the norm? Because that, and I say that again in no judgment. It's not like maybe 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it'd be like a certain type of woman would have been wearing something very provocative, like that level. It's like, no, this is just what we've established as being the norm now. And just that move towards that, really surprised me. It really surprised me. And whenever things like that happen, I always stop and think and say, well, there has to be a reason for this, and it's not just that people are bad or people are making bad decisions. Like philosophy has influence on people's decisions, and the information that we take in, how we form our conscience, the things that we believe, the things that guide us, they inform the day-to-day actions that we make. And so I was like, I held on to that for a little bit, and I was like, I think this is something I want to talk to Sarah about, because I know we can have an honest conversation about it without, again, casting any sort of dispersions on anybody or laying judgment on anything, but just kind of going into this with a question of curiosity, like what has allowed us to move in this direction. And I think that where we ended our last conversation about freedom and Margaret Sanger's understanding of freedom and John Paul II's understanding of freedom, and comparing those two, I think is going to inform us. And so I don't have a super intense agenda for us today. I really want this to be free flowing, and we'll see what rabbit holes we go into. But I think for a place to start, that's where I would like us to begin, is help me again understand and help our listeners kind of catch up, for those who didn't listen to that episode or hadn't heard it in a while. What is the central kind of clash between Margaret Sanger, who we know is also a heavy influencer in modern feminist theories? So it's not just her. We can talk about others who came after her as well, or those even came before her. And John Paul II is kind of a placeholder for what the church's understanding of freedom is. Where do we see the two being in unison, and where do we see the two being in contrast? Because I think this is a big part of this conversation when it comes to modesty.
Yeah, absolutely. I only had about 50 thoughts when you were presenting that, so see where I go. First, I just want to say from the outset that obviously, as Mario mentioned, like I don't have all the answers. That's what I was so willing and excited about this conversation, is that we're just, talking about it. But I also want to let the women that are listening know, like, it sounds like a joke, but I'm really serious. I come in peace, because I have seen and experienced where this issue, even with people that I love, can be super contentious. But especially, I would say, I was thinking about in preparation for this show, I taught my first year out of college, so I was 22. The things I would have said then about modesty, they weren't bad, right? But I think, 13 years later at 35, I'm like, ooh, that lacked nuance.
You get a little older. You lack nuance. Yeah. Life helps you kind of mature a little bit and see kind of multiple sides of
it. And so there was a real part of me where I was like feeling for my students. That I was like, oh, poor things. Like, that was not that it was like intense, but it could be a bit more of an extreme than you meet. Like, it's the theory is good, but then you're inviting them to a practice, right? And I think that's the beauty of the church's understanding of modesty, is that there is a reason why there is no measurement or number, like how many inches above the knee can my skirt be within the church's teachings, right? But I think this is all, these are the layers that go to answer your question, because it allows it to be where, modesty isn't just clothes, right? It's like I mentioned, even my own experience. It's relationships, it's emotional, it's psychological, right? But I think in this context, as we're starting it, we're especially thinking about fashion and clothes and how we dress ourselves. And
yeah, I mean, we could talk about the others if we go into that conversation, for sure, in the relationship, but certainly
I want to definitely start with this, because I think this is sort of the main way that we're usually kind of considering, or at least exposed to it. And, for those who were not able to listen to the last episode, please check it out. I think you would enjoy it. But in short, Margaret Sanger and John Paul II both wanted women to know their goodness, and they wanted women to experience the freedom that they deserved to live their lives and offer themselves in such a way that they knew the joy of what comes with offering yourself in relationship. Now, how that came out for Margaret was a colorful series of events in years. And she too, what she said when she was a younger woman, and then what she said when she was older, changed. But there were places where she argued for monogamy. There were places where she argued for, essentially, she started out by arguing for women to have a true understanding of her body, especially her biology, which John Paul II was also a huge proponent of. which this is how I got into Love and Responsibility, right, was his chapter in sexual ethics, really affirms the gift of woman and also makes clear her right to tenderness within the marital embrace, right, within sexual intercourse. And Margaret Sanger in her writings has a lot of sections actually on this same idea, you know, where she tells the man, to us, it's like, oh yeah, duh. But think about it. She was writing for a population that was experiencing a lot of poverty. You know, these are people working in factories in like the Northeast in the early 1900s. And so she was telling the guy some basic things like, okay, look, like take a shower, you know, like things that people might just assume now. But so some of the things she did, I'm not canonizing her, right? We talked about that before, but I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. There were some things that she brought up and points that she questioned, especially to the church, that she wanted to understand more of. And unfortunately, the reason why I put them in dialogue is because I saw him as someone who I myself experienced, someone in the church, specifically a man who was willing to listen to woman even when it was difficult. And even if he didn't agree with everything woman said, he first heard her before he responded. And so in my mind, I felt like the image the Lord gave me was that they were having a dialogue and a sense over coffee, which Mario has that awesome image you put with the recent post of our episode, which I love. I almost cried when I saw it. I was like, this is what I've been seeing. But anyway, and
the marvels of ChatGPT.
Oh my gosh, a whole new world.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
For Margaret and John Paul II, what I essentially realized as I persevered in my research, they both wanted what was best for women. They both wanted women to experience the great gift of freedom, acknowledging that women deserve that there's a power that comes with freedom. But where they would start to diverge is for John Paul II, freedom is always connected to responsibility, right? So not just a responsibility to oneself, but to the people that we are surrounded by in our day-to-day lives. So what I realized, and this is a huge summary, but for the sake of the show, what I realized was that for Margaret Sanger, freedom was the end. And for John Paul II, freedom was a gift. Freedom was a good. Freedom was one of the greatest things that the Lord has essentially entrusted to us. But freedom is, at the end of the day, it's only the means to the ultimate end, which is love, right? That my vocation as a woman is to offer myself as a gift, right? That man and woman, we can only find ourselves through a sincere gift of ourselves. And for Margaret, and I would say due to a lot of frustration, you know, she was a product of her environment and her culture and the eugenics that were surrounding her at the time in Europe and in the States and the people that were cheering her on and the philosophies that she imbibed that had a lot of issues and were problematic. But it's like I would describe Margaret as starting out strong with really great ideas, but then stopping too short, right, of the ultimate purpose for man and woman. And so in that place, though, there's a space for, I think, a good conversation and a good dialogue between John Paul II and Margaret Sanger that I felt like I got to be part of. But I would say here, as we look at that question and then we try to apply it, right, within the space of modesty.
Let me stop you right there.
Yeah.
Before we jump into modesty, because I want to know its connection and freedom you speak about in general. But what is freedom's relationship, or how would Margaret Sanger, John Paul II speak about freedom, in particular in the context of the sexual arena? Like, because
well, keep going.
Because I think that's a place that's a significant connector to all of this. I don't want to elaborate too much, but I want to know what you think. So what does that mean in that arena specifically? Right.
So what first comes to mind, you know, of course, because there's so many things we could say, but what first comes to mind when I hear you say that is that for Margaret, in the beginning, she wanted woman to have this information about her body, essentially, right, her fertility and her cycle, basic information to space pregnancies. And she really thought that this would be such a gift for woman, and she really wanted that for women. That same information, I would say John Paul II also wants for women, but for Margaret Sanger, she got to a place where her frustration with what she would call the irresponsibility of men began to take so much root and began to overshadow everything else, which is why she became the biggest proponent, I would say, and the encourager and the woman behind the movement to create the hormonal contraceptive pill, is because what she wanted to give to woman was the capacity to engage in the sexual act in such a way that she would not have to pay the price that she has to pay for the sexual act, since her price, and I said this before, but I really do think this, woman has a greater price to pay for the consequences of the sexual act, right? And so this is why, like, woman is the one who is so much up in arms about this issue, because in so many ways, for better or for worse, right, whether you intend the pregnancy or you don't, your body will pay the price. Like, your body is going to go through these changes. And so Margaret, I believe, was trying to give to women the freedom to be able to choose when she wanted that to happen. And while she started in the beginning, and look, there were men that wrote her letters. I mean, thousands and thousands and thousands of letters are written to her because people were trying to figure out how to space pregnancies in these ways of even knowing their bodies. And so it's not like she thought all men were incapable, but she started to get to a place where she realized, well, most of them are not going to care and take that responsibility. So I'm going to have to just help women do this themselves through another means, you know? And that's a huge part of her story where she really turned was, I think she put a couple of stories together for the sake of promoting the idea when she got started, but she told a story that I shared in the last episode about this young woman who the doctor came in and she had, I believe she had tried to perform an abortion on herself, if I'm not mistaken, and the doctor came in, she lost the baby, but the woman didn't die, but the doctor was like, you cannot get pregnant again. Like, and the woman didn't want to get pregnant again, but she didn't know how to not get pregnant again because she has these children, her husband's going to work, she's probably working a night shift, and what is she going to do? Say no? Because at that time, people have to remember the law was written in such a way that if she said no, there could be the loss of her marriage and then also her legal protection and her right to her children. So it's like a very layered, complicated reality that I think is important for people to remember, because it gives a framework with which to see that, like, women have always struggled from the beginning. And Margaret was trying to help women, in a sense, take responsibility when men were failing to do so. Does that make sense? And so I think that's a huge connection piece where for John Paul II, he would acknowledge that men are not taking responsibility in a lot of ways, but he's never losing hope that they can't yet begin again and begin to take that responsibility. Does that make sense? Like, in a sense, I would say that Margaret reached a place of the despairing of the possibility, and John Paul II, and that's something I love about him. I mean, I think people sometimes get on his case about it. They're like, oh, he's such an idealist. But I think what John Paul II realized is, like, the alternative is that I then just look at man and his depravity and I don't even try anymore. But he was like, no. He, and everything he's written, it shows that man uniquely, unlike any other creature that exists, has the capacity with his reason and his will to choose, to know. Essentially, the greatest gift, right, that we keep talking about is to choose to offer a gift to myself, which is what love is. And so man always has the chance to start over, right? That even a man who, like, I mean, you've talked about this on your show, I know, and my husband's talked about this and his experiences and his working with young men at the high school level. You know, like, so many people are like, well, I'm addicted to pornography, like, I'm never going to be able to get out of that. And it's like, no, that's not true. Like, there is hope even in that addiction. Now, how these people have to respond, right? You'll be able to speak more to that, but it's a personal responsibility, but there is hope and there can be change over time. But in the sexual act, even in how you approach your spouse, right? Like, because I think honestly, like, if it's any good marriage, you're learning about each other as you go too, and your needs are different in different seasons. So it's never like you learn it and you've arrived, you know? And I think that's where, like, John Paul II, it wasn't a naivete. It was actually a courage. I think of it as courage that he had for the sake of the human person, that man and woman could always learn and they could do better. Now, for John Paul II, another key I think is important. I often think about how his response to Humanae Vitae, which he obviously supported, but he struggled in a certain way with the way that it was written. Now, again, so he supported the teaching, but the way that it was written, because what he wanted what he would say was, quote, a more robust, like, understanding and reasoning for why men and women should follow the church's teaching on contraception, which is that you should not contracept, but you should know the rhythms of a woman's cycle and fertility and then use those, right, in terms of your family planning desires. But Margaret Sanger, she stopped short of that, because I would say that she lost hope in that. And so then the freedom became not an opportunity in a sense. It became less of an opportunity for love and more an opportunity for, not always, but it can easily become vindictive. And essentially it can become woman, which I've struggled with. I think every woman struggle with this. When we're hurt, we're like, well, I don't really need you. Like, I can do it myself, you know? And so then it separates the two in some way. Yeah.
Hey everybody, if you have found this episode at all remotely interesting or at all remotely helpful, then please on YouTube, like and subscribe. I am grateful for all of you who have done so thus far. If you are checking out this show on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, then leaving a rating, writing a review helps tremendously. All these little gestures from my listeners helps, like I said, just tremendously to be able to continue to grow the audience of the show. So if you have found this helpful in any way, then please share it with others. Otherwise, by liking, subscribe, writing a rating, writing a review, or simply just sharing it with people that you know who can benefit from this conversation on modesty. Yeah, so John Paul II says that the body exists, only really makes sense in the context of being a gift for the other. Like that's the only way that this whole thing makes sense. And so man exists for woman and woman exists for man. And so this reciprocity that's there, this relationship that's there is what's key to all of this. And that the act exists to be a gift to the spouses, but then also to bring forth children, which also are a gift to the spouses. And so it's always in the context of this donative spousal meaning of the body, which of course is what the theology of the body is communicating. And so you're saying, again, that's putting back in the context of freedom, being in the context of love, that there's this, the freer that I am, the more I have control over my passion, the more that I have a sense and understanding of who I am and the knowledge of my interior space, the freer I am to be able to give that to another person. Yeah. Rather than that freedom, which is, right?
Yeah. And I just to comment on that, he actually, in his work, The Acting Person, he talked a lot about self-possession, right? You know, so this capacity, this self-knowledge. So I know myself, I know my passions, I know my attractions. I am not determined by them. That's what freedom is I can experience, something can come over me, right? Emotionally, physically, whatever. And I'm not determined by it. But that's, he says, where we see our humanity the most, is that movement from something happens to me through that to then I choose and man acts. But I think I keep saying one of my favorite quotes, but really, you know, it's on the list of 50,000, but it's there, is that he says, freedom can only be lived within the limits of reality. So I want to say that again, because I think that applies to more than this conversation. Freedom can only be lived within the limits of reality. So this goes for, and I'm not going to go off too far, but this goes for like vocational discernment, whether you're not yet in your vocation or in your vocation, right? Freedom can only be lived within the limits of reality. Reality gives to me an objective set of circumstances, and I'm not trying to master everything to then become God. I'm trying to receive from God the gifts that he's given me, which includes the gift of my body, right? Me as a woman, I have a particular body. Each of us has a particular body. And then in response to that gift I've been given, that is how I actualize my freedom to its like fullest extent, right? Is that I know myself, I possess myself. And he says that those who the more I possess myself, that is how I am the more free. Because I mean, this is a simple analogy, but I'll use it with my students, you know, it's the difference between me walking in the room and being like, gosh, that chocolate cake looks amazing. Let me eat the whole thing, which, hello, I've experienced that temptation. Why not? Especially if it's really good. But there's a difference between is the woman who walks into the room and wants to eat the whole thing and then eats the whole thing, is she more or less free than the woman who walks in and says, maybe even like, I'm just going to have one bite, and literally just has one bite, right? It doesn't mean the chocolate cake is evil. It doesn't mean her desires are bad. But in a lot of ways, freedom is I don't want to say it's most exhibited when we say no, but it's that there's a balance and there's an order. There's an integration of our no's and our yeses, that they don't become a contradictory thing.
No, I'm going to interrupt you because I do believe that it is, and that when we can say no, it's when you raise a child and you have a toddler and that kid starts saying no for the first time in life, that actually is developmentally appropriate. As much as parents, we get frustrated by it.
Yes.
But that
Yes.
kid saying no is starting to recognize that they're a separate individual.
Well, let me
who
explain
has
why I'm
who has
saying that.
capacity.
Because I use the statement that you just said all the time, and I do agree with it. But in the context of modesty, since we're talking about that, I'm thinking of another layer that I want to say, which is, so like, yes, sometimes it is exhibited by no. But I want to say in the fuller context is that it's an integration of the no's and the yeses. That at sometimes it's appropriate for me to say no, and sometimes it's appropriate for me to say yes. And I'm literally just thinking, and this is kind of me diving into the topic, but I'm saying this because I'm thinking of the times where I was told no. You cannot wear that. You should not wear that. And I look back now and I see this person that told me this thing. It wasn't ordered correctly, but I, as an impressionable 18-year-old, felt such a pressure. And then that no becomes a shame. Does that make sense? So like, yes, I agree with you. But in this context, I just want people to hear, because what I want them to see is that modesty can so often feel like a big fat red no. Like, no, you can't do this. No, you can't wear that. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of times in our education, it can become such a rule-oriented teaching that we miss the mark, which is this robust freedom that we're talking about. You know, that there may be a time where, you know, like, this is an example that's popping in my mind, but like when I'm studying at the seminary, I felt a particular responsibility that what I wore was important and needed to be appropriate, you know? Now, I can admit to you that I have more of a scrupulous personality, so sometimes I know I overthought that because I'm like, oh my gosh, like, what am I allowed to wear? I'm like, the fact that you're thinking about it probably means it's going to be okay. You know, it's usually when we're just like haphazard, we don't take any responsibility for others, whatever. But I think that's the point I want to hit, is that as we're talking about modesty, I so often have seen young women in high school hear nothing, especially if they're not have any background in Christianity or especially Catholicism. And they're like, I have one of my dearest friends, she's not Christian at all. And she's like, why? 'Cause I asked her recently, how did you feel about going to all girls Catholic high school? Like, what are some of the points that you wish they would have done differently? And she was like, why are y'all so obsessed with virginity and the body? And like, I felt like all I heard was, you have this precious gift and make sure you don't give it away, because then you can't get it back, you know? And I thought that was a really important, like, the chastity talks obviously have an important role. I think they're actually falling away and we need to not let them go, but not to the extreme. Like, I know you've talked recently with Mary Bruno. I thought it was a great conversation, not to like, so what I'm trying to say is modesty and chastity is not the end. Just like freedom is not the end. They're the means to the end, which is love. So when we're thinking about like dress, for example, and I know we're going to get into some of the nuances still, but when we're thinking about that, you know, it's got to be in the context of relationship, which, to bring it back to your original question, where I see the bridge that happens between the Margaret Sanger conversation with John Paul II and this conversation is that for John Paul II, he was always talking about the marital embrace and the relationship between man and woman within the context of a loving, like, mutual reciprocity, integrated relationship. And so the goal was that love would be part of it. And he could see it because he saw it exemplified, these couples he walked with, like, it was possible. For Margaret, she saw the ways where love failed and was absent. And so she really lost, I would say, this appreciation or even this belief in the possibility for that love is possible in that context. So then freedom became the end because there was nothing left after it. Does that make sense? And so I think that's what happens with like modesty is, I mean, there's so many directions we can go with this, but I have seen this happen in the conversation with modesty is that if it becomes the end, then it becomes the like sole identity and responsibility like of a young woman, for example, then it can take away from her, and I would say rob her of the joy of like, she's 18 and she just doesn't need to freak out about the details that much, you know? But at least she's thinking about it versus like, I remember being a freshman in high school, being in religion class, and the girl behind me, I just never heard of this before. And she was like, oh yeah, my mom taught me like, if you've got it, flaunt it. And I was like, really? And I'm like, first of all, okay, wait, we can do that. Secondly, do I have it? Like, what is it? You know, like, and like you start thinking because you're like 14 years old, you know?
Right.
And
I
just think people also remembering what we're living in now. I praise God we didn't have social media when I was in high school the way that we have it now, you know? And you think about the young women that are, if they don't know that they're loved, if there's no context for relationship, then love is lost, freedom is the goal, and modesty just becomes like a chain.
So then the sex in that context, well, sure, certainly. So I guess I appreciate everything you're saying, and not being a woman, not hearing the stories that you've heard or experiencing them firsthand, or I only have boys also, so I'm not raising girls. So I'm very sensitive and appreciative of your experience that you're bringing to this. And on that cruise, I had a conversation with my sister, and she had who has 2 girls, and she had different opinions than I had about what was happening on in terms of the dress and the style of dress and different things. And so I appreciate the fact that as a woman, you have a different perspective on this. And so before we even just jump into that, I guess what I'm trying to understand still, at least from a philosophical perspective, and I know I need to do more reading here, but from Margaret Sanger to string bikinis becoming the norm, like we're speaking about a notion then, like there's a lot of steps obviously that get to that. But if sex then is no longer viewed as something in the context of love and exchange and gift, how then is it viewed? Is it then viewed in the context of, well, it just in the domain of pleasure? Is it viewed just in the domain of I don't know, shared experience or hobby, or we have just a very different language and appreciation for sex. And so I think that in the absence of, well, if freedom then exists just for its own sake, then nobody can say anything about what I should wear, right? That's part of it too, is that you can then just wear whatever it is you want,
right,
and not expect to have any sort of consequences, or that has no impact on the broader social circle.
Right.
Is that the thinking? I mean, like, I think that's what I'm trying to get. Do you understand? I'm really wrestling with this question.
Yeah. Well, I think part of it, totally honesty, is like most people aren't wrestling with it. Like they don't care. Like they're like,
they don't care.
And I don't mean they don't care because they're flippant and irresponsible. They don't care because they're like,
no, they just accepted it. Like, this is just
that
what
are going on.
Yeah.
And it can be so subtle. Like, and it can be so, I mean, I think for a lot of women I know, they're like, gosh, I don't want to hear any more talks about that. I mean, but I remember like when I think of modesty, I remember even 10 years ago, and again, it depends, like leggings were becoming a thing. And
right.
I remember feeling like I was not allowed to wear them. Like in my mind, no one told me that. I mean, I think people did probably tell me that. But then like now it's a lot more accepted in the norm. It's not sort of, as I would say, like it's common. People wear it in Europe to go into churches, you know, which I'd be like, that's a line. But anyway, but my point is, you know, I think it's the necessary nuance that comes with when we're presenting modesty. I would say the 2 main points I would make that come to mind when I'm thinking about it in this context. Number one, it has got to be within the context, again, of love and relationship. That like love and relationship, also like respect for myself, that I have been given this gift of my body. And it does have to, like when I'm talking with young men, for example, I do tell them like, hey, I am so sorry for all the times that woman's body is just thrown in your face, because you can't drive down the street like 20 feet without it being thrown in your face. And we have to acknowledge at some point as men and women that we are biological creatures who have been wired to be attracted to one another. And men and women are both visual. Men, I think, obviously have much more of a visual like sensitivity.
You know how fast it takes for a guy to determine physical attraction to a woman?
Yeah, so fast.
You know how fast it is?
I don't remember. It's like something like 2 seconds.
Yeah. Not even. It's 0.4.
Yeah. And also that point.
Before a guy even thinks, before he can even think about it, he's already attracted. You know?
And I do want to say, while we're on this point, this is just Sarah Denny's little soapbox, so I don't want to go too far on this. But recently I heard a young man who has, I would say, some kind of a platform, explaining how like women, they either have it or they don't. She's either hot or she's not. And like women can be, over time, they can find the guy more attractive they didn't before, but men, you either have it or you don't. And I was like, look, I just started to think that if you're not 30, like if you're under 30, all these people with public platforms, they might want to wait a few years, because I think you might regret some of the things that you're saying.
You can regret some of the things that are being said.
Enough.
Exactly.
But what I meant, I got frustrated because I was like, there's so many women following him. and so many men following him. And it's so sad to me because I'm like, it can
Yeah.
be like that. But again, you're selling yourself short. Like yes, on a biochemical level, the attraction is like the point, whatever second. But like then we step back, right? Like you talk about with your people, and you integrate that,
that's
and
the
you
point
get
with
to know
Jump
the
on the Second.
person.
Well,
Exactly.
It's just a
And
feeling.
so,
It's just a feeling.
exactly.
Like it's just a feeling.
It doesn't determine you, right? So yeah, I think that's like the context of love and relationship. Like if a woman, like we had a conversation about another example that someone that said they were a Christian and they were engaging in these activities that you were like, oh wow, that feels kind of duplicitous. If you do not have an encounter with the Lord, if you do not know Jesus, like seriously, I can teach this all day long. I can teach till I'm blue in the face, and I see my students years later, and I love them no matter what they're wearing. But the reality is, like, I can't convince them of this quote teaching. It has to be a movement where they come to understand that the Lord loves them so much that their body's part of that gift. And then they see it as no matter what a man thinks, it's a respect of self and how I'm going to present myself to him, but also respect that he has a responsibility, right? In response to no matter what I'm wearing. If I'm wearing something and I'm totally scantily clad, it's still his responsibility, right? In response to me, to respect me. However, to respect men with how they're wired. Like, and that's what I'm typically trying to teach the young women is like, these men are wired in such a way, right? They're created in such a way. It is good that they are drawn to you. It's good that they are drawn to your bodies. Like, this is how God designed it. But we need to then respect them enough to not like always be throwing it in their faces. But that was like, I mean, I was coaching track.
Unless we've established that maybe objectification isn't what we think it is.
Well, I think,
or maybe we don't care.
A huge piece of this is that,
because like this, so like the example that you just brought up is something that we talked about before we started recording. Was I read an article about some OnlyFans model. That was the context, and she was like, "Well, I'm a Christian, I'm a virgin, and I have these images of me, but I'm not doing anything sexual." And I was like, "Okay, I mean, you're right. You said you're not having the sexual act.
Sexual act, okay, right?
You're not in the sexual act, yes, but you're making." However many millions, $47 million is what she said over the year, which is the headline of the article. And I was like, man, I'm in the wrong business, first and foremost. I mean, I'm joking.
But really, I think it's that. Yeah,
Sorry.
He clearly is.
But my point, my point in making the comment was that otherwise, like is it that you just like don't, she clearly knows the guys who are paying for her content, what they're doing with the content. They're not just like watching it and be like, oh, hey, this is great. I mean, like she's clearly aware that this is a conscious decision that she's made. And so like that sense of objectification or usury, what we see in the Catholic sense is not viewed anymore in kind of a secular sense anymore. Like she's just like, this is what it is. It's fine.
And I think too, John Paul II, he often said in Love and Responsibility that if you want to teach modesty, the best way to teach that is to educate young women on the psychology of man. But I am married to an incredible man, one of the most integrated men I know. And I still am sometimes like, wait, men think blah, 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 blah. And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, I did not understand. And I'm 35 and I'm still learning things. So when I'm educating a 16-year-old, right, it's like, I mean, the way that they're able to process that, what it means to them. I mean, just, I want everyone to hear that that's part of it too, is it's not that they're not listening to me. It's not that maybe even some part of them isn't drawn to it, but at the end of the day, and this is maybe my biggest, like, this is why this topic is so hard for me. And I think why people are just sort of tired of it, especially like women, is at the end of the day, though, I can teach my girls all this stuff. But if I put them in a party with the average guy their age, who is he going to talk to? Right. He's not going to talk to her, most probably, unless he's been grown and formed, right? Like it's possible. There are those young men out there, and I know that because I've met them, right? But in the like common culture, and I experienced that many times in my life too, where you just like, you know that you want to dress in a certain way or speak in a certain way, that you're respecting yourself, but you can also stand by and watch and feel like, gosh, like, but Lord, like these men go around speaking like, oh, I think women should respect themselves in this way and that way. But then sometimes they're just not thinking with their heads, and they're not really paying attention to the women that are really trying to respect them. And so women can only feel invisible for so long before they start doing, I would say, behavior
Right. I see what you're
changes.
saying.
And
Yeah,
I don't mean that to be like they're always that way. It could be one set of circumstances. Like, it doesn't mean this
No,
woman
this
always
is reality
thinks just
that we're
like,
speaking about.
right,
This is the
right.
reality that we're speaking about.
But
This is all of it.
I think
Absolutely.
too-
And that's what people, the comments online with the OnlyFans article, you know, that woman, it was like, well, if guys weren't paying for it, then she wouldn't be doing it. So it's kind of a similar kind of
Yeah,
argument.
that's my
It's-
point.
Of course, it's true.
Yeah.
Of course.
And
of
again,
course, of
I
course.
can't speak to her. What I wish, when we were talking about before, I was telling my husband this. I was like, what I wish I could do is, I wish I could just sit with this young woman and talk to her. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm not judging her or making an accusation of her because I don't know her story and how she got here. In her mind, I'm sure she clearly genuinely thinks certain things are fine and certain things. I don't know how she's understanding this. I think there's a lapse in something, but I have no idea if she was ever told, you know, besides the quote teaching, and if she stays within certain bounds of how she thinks that teaching is, if there's no relationship with the Lord, and I'm not saying she doesn't have one, but I'm saying if she has never been convicted in the deepest places of her heart, of her value in such a way that this devalues her, then why wouldn't she do it? Right? Like, so it just.
But that's my point, is that we would say that it devalues her, right? We recognize that, but in her mind, she doesn't think so. See it that way.
Yeah,
she doesn't think so, right? And that right there is exactly. So I appreciate just the back and forth here, because that's exactly the argument, is that, like, you listen to something like, well, okay, so the presidential election here recently, right? I mean, podcasts became part of the conversation. So Trump goes on the bro podcasts and drums up a lot of male support, and Kamala realizes that Trump's doing this, so she makes a bid to try to go on some of the more female-heavy podcasts to drum up her support. And what's the podcast that she goes on? The Call Her Daddy podcast by Alex Cooper, which is the most popular podcast among women. And you don't have to listen to the podcast. You just go through the subject headings of each of the podcasts, and it's all about sex. I mean, that's what that podcast is. It's all about sex. And it's like, there's just again, not in the sex that we've been speaking about in terms of the context of it being loving and in a relationship. It's like, so it gets back to the Margaret Sanger kind of comment. It's like, well, if usury is just what's part of it, then I guess, is it just that women should just be first to the punch on that? I mean, is that like the argument that's coming out from those groups of philosophy? Both sides neither side should be using each other. Okay. So, and then John Paul II's answer is, we got to learn to love in responsibility. But it seems like the other side, well, if usury is going to happen, then at least let's get to the same playing field. Let's level the playing field, and let's be capable of using as much as men are.
Yeah. I mean, I think that definitely, you know, I can't put
if
words
I'm wrong,
in her
please let
mouth.
me know. I'm just trying to understand.
No, I mean, but this is what I meant from the beginning is, like, please, everyone hear me. I do not have all the answers. Like, I haven't honestly thought about this particular topic in a while, because I haven't been teaching in the high school setting in over 3 years.
Yeah. Sure.
But what I can say is that, you know, I don't know what Margaret would have thought about, like, the string thongs and bikini. I have no idea what she would have thought. I don't know what, you know, that. And I wonder what she would have thought. I think Margaret early 1900s might have thought something different than Margaret, like, more in the 1940s, 1950s. But
yeah,
the
postmodernists who came after her, right? I mean, wasn't there an active attempt to like some of the attempts was to break women away from the nuclear family so that her freedom 100%. Could actually exist on its own.
Right. And I think when you're
asking, that's the concrete manifestation that we're seeing, right?
Right. Well, and I think what you're asking about this, what is it? And I'm like, recreation, union, but in the sense of, I get to have my pleasure, you get to have yours. I mean, I think of a Cosmopolitan magazine cover I saw like 8 years ago that was like, I don't know, 30 sex moves to make him worship you. And I'm like, here's the key.
Right.
In Genesis 3, and I can say this because this is a Christian podcast, but I really mean this. In Genesis 3, when it says, one of the punishments, your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. So her desire for her husband, he twists that and he dominates her. Whereas Jean Paul II is like, you don't have to stop there, right? Like, with grace, right? The new covenant, we've been given this grace that from within, I might be tempted to, but I do not have to lord it over her. I can respect her as my equal, right? It's a mutual submission in all ways, which is a whole nother conversation, but feel very strongly about that.
Yeah, no.
That's
part of it.
And I think, what we're seeing is she saw and he shall rule over you. And she was like, not anymore. And women were clamoring for an option that he could not rule over her. I mean, and when you think about it in the context of 2024, this is not disconnected from my body, my choice. Like so many things, it's so defensive of like, keep your hands, keep your thoughts, keep your opinions off of me. Like, so it's in a certain way, like if I say the same sentence you say, Mario, even if they don't like it, women are still going to get mad at me if they don't like it. But it's different if it comes from me, even if you speak the truth, right? Like if it's coming from a man and I'm a woman and I'm tired of feeling like people are telling me what to do in this sphere, right? Because it can be even that much more frustrating when it comes from a man, because it's that argument that people are making that you just referenced with OnlyFans, which is that, well, if men were not paying for it, she wouldn't be doing it.
Right.
But I think another aspect is, and again, this is just me on it's my personal reflection. Yeah. But I find it interesting, and I think this is part of truly what's seeped in is the effect of pornography that I think is just like it's like bubbling up under so many 100%. Things with everything, right? I think one of the aspects that I find interesting is, for example, one of my friends and I was talking with her about this issue, and she was like, why she's getting so much money? It's like part of this reality. Like, we don't have to be naive to it. It's because she is a virgin. Like there's something of this like purity and that's what she's seeing and thinking it as. And then also like what women are doing with their bodies and with their clothing, to attract men, what men are doing. Like, I find it very interesting that, I'm not saying this is bad. I'm saying I'm thinking out loud, and I haven't quite figured out what I think about it yet. But I find it interesting that I've never seen or known in the culture, as much as it is now, that men have to be so perfectly groomed. Like, so like everything is like put together and like the gel. I'm not saying that's wrong, but I'm saying like everything is like pristine in such a way that I'm like, why are we always shooting? Like, and it's very physical. Like everything, there's like this physical emphasis. Like, I have to take the gym selfie, and I'm obsessed with how my body looks, Like, and I'm all about men working out. I'm all about health. But like, I feel like the men are adopting this sort of obsession with self that women are more naturally, I feel like, going to struggle with because of the way that men view them. But then therefore also women in our language, right? The way that women talk about men, I would say increasingly what I've heard is women in their communication about men, it sounds much more akin to me of what men would sound like in reference to women.
Yes.
If a woman walks by, right, a comment a man makes. If a man walks by, I'm like, this is just personally, maybe it's because I grew up on old movies, so I was like, they're black and white, and he says she's a doll, and I'm like, oh, and he's a schmuck. Like, that's, but I just feel like there's these like undertones that we're not even realizing, and then it becomes like, even in our speech, like let's say modesty and speech, I know people and I've seen people, and I even feel that temptation myself, right? It's like, how much more am I going to get a view on this video if I use some sort of vulgarity, right? Because then I become like edgy, right? And then like so yep. I'm like going into this sphere where you're going to listen to me because I added a curse word or I added the F-bomb, right? But it's because I needed to make my point so strong. And it's like, but
Right.
Why do we then, even in our language, right? Like we're giving power in a sense to that which is it's almost more absorbed with self, right? Instead of like open.
100%,
does that make sense? And like, this is just me talking out loud, so I don't really know where I'm landing, other than those are things I consider when I think about this.
So exactly. So this. And it's hard because you're right. Like I would love to sit down with every single person and be like, here's the gospel. Here's why you need to love Jesus. And we start there, and then we can get into questions about modesty and why being OnlyFans is not exactly, here's an understatement, compatible with what Jesus is teaching. It's like, we can see, okay, so I'd love to be able to have that, but where our culture, and I know it's easy to be like, oh, our culture's lost, our culture is gone, like the sexual immorality is just, I get that. But if we're going to try to evangelize people, we have to start by listening. And this is why I've always appreciated our conversations, is because you've done so much of listening to Margaret Sanger's work, is to be able to look at it and say, well, what's the motivations that are there? Like, what is it? and then where can change start happening in terms of people's thinking? You're right. It's not that you start in the end and be like, well, just don't wear that or don't do that. And I think that for so often has been the case. We're saying, no, let's bring this back a little bit, and let's understand why the thinking has moved in a direction where we can say this is totally normal. Like dressing this way is totally normal. Acting this way is totally normal. It's just, and not just normal, it's an expectation now in certain cases, which is what makes dating so difficult. Because I hear from my male clients as much as I hear from my female clients, honestly. I know the stereotype's there. It's like, oh, well, women, they go on a couple dates and, guy says, are we going to sleep together? Honestly, Sarah, I'm hearing similar things from my male clients. That it's a question of values at that point in terms of like, do they practice or do they not? And I know even in Catholic circles, I've heard both. So I get that, but it's just the expectation is just, this is what it is. And so we don't view sex anymore in this context of being gift. And so one thing I want to shift gears here, if I can, and it's connected to it, but like, I think this is where even John Paul II's notions of shame are really instrumental, I think, in this conversation.
Yeah.
JP2 says that in the theology of the body, he identifies shame as like a boundary or like a marker is what he's calling it. He says, when you look at in Genesis and they were naked without shame, and then they eat the apple, and then they recognize that they are now naked, and so they make loincloths to cover themselves up. He says it's the shame that is that boundary between original man and then fallen man. It's like now that the presence of shame is here, there's something changed within humanity. Mm-hmm. And he says that the shame doesn't come from God. It's something that originates from within us. It's something that comes in response to the fall. And shame, it would be the sense of there's something good. Now, this is JP2's language, and help me understand if I'm right or wrong on this. But it's that there's something good here that I'm aware of, and now I experience a fear that this good could be violated. And so shame is a recognition that there's something good, but there's also a fear that this something good could be violated. Hence, we have to clothe ourselves and cover ourselves up, because now the nature, the physical dimension of man and the physical dimension of woman, which is meant to always be complementary, now serves as potential for real heartache, real pain, because now we can use one another in a way that we weren't capable prior to sin entering into the world. And so the sense of shame is something that needs to be talked about. Now, again, I'm a therapist, and so we deal with shame often in other arenas. And shame is often linked with fear. And so there's a notion that fear and shame kind of have some connections there, and I can dive into that a little bit more. But when I read John Paul II, and when he's speaking about this, is he says, if again, we can acknowledge that now this is part of our reality, okay? This is part of our existence, is that we do have to protect ourselves from one another. We want to be open and have honesty and vulnerability, but at the same time, we also have to recognize that I can't fully trust everybody who lays eyes on me. Like that's being naive. That the shame there is helpful, that it helps to protect to some degree that which is good. So then you can look at that and you can say, well,
yeah, I just wanted to kind of comment on that really quick and say that I often think of, I'm not sure where I read this, but I think of then modesty in this context as like it's like the custodian. Like it's like what walks with you in these spaces and places where you're discerning what it even means to be gift, and you're figuring it out. And then, and I think how I read exactly what I think you described so beautifully that John Paul II talks about is that when I've described it to my students, I'll be like, in a sense, shame's purpose can be good in that it's like a very natural protection of the gift that you're like innately, wait, I am good. There's something good. It's like when someone walks in and you're taking a shower, you're going to, if they're not supposed to be in there, you're like, whoa, because there's something that because I do not know or trust that you are going to see me and view me the way that I deserve. And so I need to veil that which you might abuse in a sense, in your mind, even whatever, because it is such a gift that it's only meant for that person whom is able to respect and love me in this place where I am fully myself, So I see that as that gift, that protective custodian.
When it's done appropriately, back to what we're speaking about, right? Because That's right. It's the protective custodian when it's inappropriate, because we can go to too far of a conservative side where then that means then, and this is not what we're advocating, is that any sort of curvature or it has to be covered up. Like any skin could be potentially sinful or temptation. That would be the extreme that we're avoiding. But then the other extreme would be the other side of the political spectrum or philosophical spectrum, which just gets into then saying, well, that shame is the thing that needs to be overcome. And so just let it go and push through beyond it and just do it, just wear the thing, regardless of what others' opinions are. And so it's like, and I guess you can only do that when you say, well, then let's just be, shameless in this sense. It's like, well, just let it go and I don't know, disregard or not think that somebody could still use you. I mean, that's the place that just kind of I really think that there's a disconnect that's there.
I mean, and I think, again, this conversation, which we've made very clear, it's not an accusation. It's not like we wish we could sit with all these people and talk to them one-on-one and hear them. But I think it's an interesting, to me, it's like a spectrum, if that makes sense. And I'm going to use a different analogy.
Yep.
But there's a country song I love that I played for my girls. I don't know what it's called, but it's something like Take a Drunk Girl Home. And it talks about a guy who meets a girl in a bar and she's drunk and he takes her home and he leaves the keys on the counter and his number by the phone and he leaves. Like he leaves her alone. He doesn't do anything to her with her. And the whole point of the song is like a real man doesn't use a woman who is in a position of vulnerability just because he can. But true strength is to respect her even in that place. And I want to kind of respond to a few things you just said, if you don't mind, while it's on my mind.
Yeah,
and,
please.
One of those would be, just speaking from experience, especially if Christians are listening to this, right? Any Catholics that are listening to this. I remember being in my young 20s as I continue to grow. And my friends and I talked about this recently. And we had what we call the skirt phase, which skirts are not bad. They're beautiful. They're feminine. I love them. But I played sports my whole life. I did not play sports in skirts. And so I remember, though, being told by people who I looked up to that this was more feminine and a woman's more beautiful. She wears this. And also it's much better for men because reason X, Y, and Z. And I remember being handed a paper that someone had written that said the church said this, which she does not. That it was holier for a woman to wear dresses and that women should never wear pants. And I say that just to give light to hey, I'm a woman who also went through phases because I really thought it was true. And I had to figure out, as did some of my friends, right? And we were like, wait, so I'm saying it's okay if you've swung this way or that way on the spectrum, even in the direction where we're like, ooh, I think that was maybe too revealing. Okay. You learn from it. And I also think an important part of this that I've talked about with my friends many times is every single woman on the planet is built differently. So oftentimes I remember in high school, the emphasis was usually on women's upper body, right? And how she's dressing there. And that was kind of the norm because of how shirts were changing and how they were cut, like how shirts were cut. But then fast forward to those 10 years ago with those leggings and I'm almost 5'10", and my legs are very long. That's why I'm a runner. And so if I wore leggings versus my 5'4" friends, right, there's a much different context in how, and that's annoying. Honestly, it's annoying because I'm like, well, you can wear that. I want to be able to just wear that and not worry about it. But the reality is my responsibility is different than my friends, but her responsibility in certain ways can also be more demanding in other contexts. So it's I just want the women to hear that sometimes it's so annoying because you might be in a season or the fashion might be in a season where the place where you would struggle more because you have to be more creative and because the fashion doesn't always meet the need. And this is the reality. When I first taught, and this was 2011, for the Christmas dance, I on the side, I told the girls, I'm not meeting up with you to hang out, but I will be at the mall at this time. And if anybody wants help and you happen to be in the dress section, obviously I'm standing outside, but just come and show me. And if you wanted an idea, right, I can tell you, but the dresses were ridiculous. These girls are really trying, but the options are just, I'm not saying it's impossible. There are some beautiful places, but they are limited. And so the girls can just get really tired, especially at these girls' high schools where they're trying to teach them the right way. But if you're short with them, and if you're like, it can very easily, it's so, I don't know how to explain it, but on that spectrum, shame can quickly go from my protective custodian that helps me see myself the way I deserve to my body is bad. And these most beautiful parts of my body are that which limit me, and I feel ashamed of them, and I want to hide them. I don't want people to see them. I feel weird or icky because this guy's looking at me and he must be thinking this. And then women hide in a way that they're not called to. And that's a different extreme. You know what I'm saying? And that's where when I was in my quote skirt phase in my early 20s, that's the phase I was in. And I had to come to realize, like, but that's what we work through, you know, like, and I think that's the thing is like modesty also changes for women. How many babies have you had? Like your body, I worked at a women's retail store in Taylor Loft. I cannot tell you the number of women. I would be in the dressing room, like, you know, they have a number of rooms and there's like a hallway, and my job is to go and like, does anybody need anything? If they need a different size, I go and get it. I cannot tell you the number of women who would be crying or frustrated because they couldn't find something to wear. And they just wanted to wear something classy. And so I say that also to give a context for like, I don't know who has time to go shopping anymore. I don't even have kids yet. And I'm like, man, shopping was like fun in my 20s. I mean, I know Amazon exists, like, but like it's a whole nother thing for women to do. And that's why some women are like, please don't even have this conversation with me. I'm over it. Some women are like, please just like, let me be. I'm trying to like do the best I can. I don't have room for that. But I would say most women, where it comes up to be important again, is with our children. Is because we're seeing the change in the culture and we're like, okay, what can we do to educate? Which is why I think it's so important, because you are showing us, Mario, the gift of educating and forming young men, that they are even convicted that this woman might be dressing in a way that we would say she's not always being viewed the way she deserves, because she's revealing more than maybe she realizes in that context is like helpful for her. But at the same time, your sons are being raised to still respect her anyway. And so too, there are women who are growing up and realizing like, gosh, all my friends are wearing this and I'm just not comfortable. And this young woman is growing in confidence to say, you know what, it's not common. That guy may not talk to me, but like, this is what I'm worth and I'm going to persevere in it. And then there's these like little glittering moments where like, I'm sure your son gets an affirmation for being so respectful and the girls see the difference. And then these women, the boys eventually also mature. And I mean, I've heard some men older than me say stupid things still, but there are also men who are like so respectful, and a woman can tell when she's being looked at respectfully. And I think that's where like she learns again, oh wait, I love myself enough that in my conversations and how I dress and how I act, the end is not for me. And I say this because I'm speaking to the women in your 20s and 30s, especially in this next comment. It is so tempting to want to be worshipped. I mean, like that's
back to the Cosmo article.
Exactly. Like it's just so tempting. And I know what I can say, what I can wear to get a bit more attention. And I know that I've been in situations of longing and of ache where that temptation was screaming at me. Right. And it doesn't mean you can't still be nice. It doesn't mean that you can't still be funny. It just means that sometimes we need to just pay attention. It's like, if this guy that I was talking to at that point in my life is getting like super interested because maybe I touched his shoulder a little bit too long, you know, like whatever the things are, you learn. It's not things that are like, I'm not talking moral evil and you've now sinned and like, forget it, you screwed up.
Right.
But just, I think like modesty, if we think about it more as a training, and that's what they say chastity is, right? I love the Catechism's quotes on chastity. Everyone listening to this, if you go to, what is it, the 6th commandment, and you read on the reflections on chastity, it talks about how chastity protects and modesty protects the intimate center of the person. It's about the integrity of the person and the integrality of the gift between the persons, right? It's about this training in self-mastery. But it then says that self-mastery is a long and exacting work. So it's like what we've talked about this whole time. We've never arrived and we're all in different places of the journey. So what I always have to learn is it's less about me casting a stone, you know, if a woman's dressing a way that I'm like, why is she doing that? You know, and more of like, offer up a prayer for her, not because I know more than her, but just like that she knows how beautiful she is. And maybe even you compliment, you know what I'm saying? Like women, we struggle with this comparison competition stuff. And I think one of the best ways to combat that is if you see a woman, like you're not there to judge her. if you really admire something about her, maybe you think her skirt's too short, but maybe you really like how she did her hair. Tell her, like instead of us beating each other up and competing, it's like we're actually all on the same team. And if I lift up this woman and her beauty, I lift up all of us, Anyway, I just wanted to share that because I think that's important in the context of just experience for women, especially.
Are you a young adult or a college student struggling to know what to say when you have that nervous energy around somebody that you're attracted to? Gentlemen, do you know what to say to that pretty girl? Ladies, do you know how to respond when that guy shows interest to you? If this is you and you are struggling with those words, then please head on over to drmarisacasa.com and download my free dating toolkit. In it, you're going to get 30 great suggestions for how to be able to manage those conversations, whether it's online or in person. I understand that confidence often comes from competence. And sometimes when we are feeling this nervous energy, it's simply because we just don't know what to say. We need some script, some words. Well, I got you covered. So head on over to drmarisacasa.com, download that free dating toolkit, and get those words to know what to say so you can start regaining some sense of confidence around people that you're attracted to. So we recognize it's a difficult conversation. And I know when I had Mary Bruno on, some of the ramifications of the chastity, purity culture, and the impacts that has in the sexual arena in marriage. And I've had numerous couples that I've seen in counseling where a book like I Kissed Dating Goodbye was very detrimental to them. And that's all been very well documented. That experiment's been run. It's over. I get it. But I see also, again, back to just, if we're just pulling to extremes, the other extreme is there's a lot of people who, after they have conversions and they come to recognize, the gift of what was there. And I mean, there's part of the conversion that comes after recognizing and saying, okay, like, how do we start to live and operate within the reality of where I'm at, and seeing that there is a real shift. So an example here, I gave a talk on, and maybe I've shared this already too, I don't know, but I gave a dating talk on a college campus a couple years ago. And after I thought I was giving a talk just to like standard kind of campus ministry stuff, but it wasn't. It was actually like a more diverse group beyond just the campus ministry. It was open to everybody. And I'm giving my talk and I'm talking about, dating and the different steps in dating and how to monitor, measure what works, what doesn't work, but then speaking a little bit about chastity and its context and the importance that it has in dating. Get after the talk's done, packing things up, and I have a young man come up and he says, no one has ever told me that not having sex was an option. Never heard it before. And so I feel like I feel the pressure. This is a guy telling me this. I feel the pressure of having to give in just for the sake of maintaining the relationship, but it's not what I want. And no one had ever told me that this was not an option, because in all my classes on campus, everybody just talks about, be safe, express yourself, have a great time, be respectful. Of course, don't impose anything, but no one ever actually says you don't have to if you don't want to, or rather it's actually better for you if you choose chastity in this proper context that we've been speaking about. Yeah. And again, it just blew my mind. I go back to like the same thing, like with just like seeing all those women on the cruise. I was like, there is a real paradigm shift that's happened here. It happened. It happened. And we're trying to just shift it back a little bit. Again, not bringing people to the other extreme, but just bringing people back to the virtue, which is in the center. And we're just not speaking the same language anymore, I think.
And I think that actually is the point that I think is essential for us to share, is that even as Mara and I were going back and forth and talking about the potential of this show, I've been trying to sort of, and this is what I tend to do, so I want to be very clear as well, but like I've been trying to honor the various aspects of different women who might be listening and their experience of the story, right? But there is something to be said for, though I can't speak to everyone, like I really dove into Margaret Singer, I really dove into John Paul II, but the philosophies are, the modern philosophies are so wrapped up right now in terms of this, the subjective emphasis to the detriment of objective reality, such that I can determine and create reality no matter what anyone else thinks. So
that's it.
When we take that to its logical end, right? My actions have consequences and I have to accept that. In my subjective idealized world fantasy, and this is where Margaret Sanger went awry. If you create a fantasy land, right? Like you're also not free as a human being, because then everyone seeks to serve you and they live for your benefit instead of what is that quote? Like, we have forgotten that we belong to each other. Someone really profound. I don't remember who said that, but it
Yeah,
to me,
I don't know. Sounds great.
yeah, I'm like, I hope it was someone legit, but I know someone said it. But it's like, we have forgotten that we belong to each other, that we're actually on the same team, both men and women, I mean. And we, even our language, I mean, and this is where I get so frustrated, because our language is being so, in a sense, like hijacked, where I'm like, no, we can't just hijack and change the meaning of terms, right? And this is where it's another conversation, right? But even like pronouns or the meaning of man and the meaning of woman, like there's such a beautiful richness to the objectivity that's not just one box. Like, human persons have such a vast arena with which we get to express ourselves. But I think the problem that you and I
Mother Teresa.
Oh, great.
Mother Teresa.
Someone awesome. Shocking.
That's the quote.
Well,
Yep.
and I really, that was on
If
my
we
heart.
have no peace, it is. If we have no peace, it is because we have forgotten that we belong to each other.
Yes. So
Mother
as
Teresa.
we've been talking, this quote has been resounding on my heart of like, I think that's really what
There
it
it
is, Mario, is that we've forgotten that we belong to each other. And within the cultural context, there's such a confusion about objective truth. So there's such also a confusion about morality. And there's such a confusion that morality is actually an invitation to the freedom that I mean and you mean from the beginning with JP2, that it's the means for me to reach my fullest self, because I offer myself in a gift of love, whereby I also receive myself back in that gift of reciprocity. And so in this modesty conversation, it's a question of, what are your values? And we have got to, the greatest gift we can give is to educate. We have to educate. And this is what it means to inform our conscience, right? Like John Paul II, I can't remember which document because there's a million, but he talks very, I would say, consistently and clearly, but especially for the young, right? Like it is an injustice when we rob the young of their innocence. And so media, right? Like what we're watching with movies, what we listen to with songs, all of these things are important. And again, I don't mean this in some sort of like extreme, scrupulous way, right? Like I'm not saying there's no joy, right? There's so many silly songs and whatever out there. But what I'm saying is, like, we have to come to take stock of what is reality. Okay. Reality is that there are so many things coming in right now. Reality is also that if you are a parent, you are still a parent, and your child is still not yet your friend. They are your child. And so what are the means and the boundaries that you have to help create for them while you have this short amount of time that you're helping form them, to show them what they are, right? As a young man or a young woman, to show them the value that they have, but then also modeling that by how you see and respect yourself, you know, and that's even just conversations around the dinner table, conversations to each other, like communication styles, like it's different for every family, but it's an invitation to deeper. And my point is that John Paul II is saying, like, we mustn't rob the young of their innocence. And so we have a responsibility to educate, even in the sense of what is pure, what is modesty, like what is necessary, so that I can have my set of values and share those with my children. And even if they are faced with a temptation to doubt their value system, or they're living in a world, which they will, and we want them to, with people who have different values, they can still be unafraid to love, because they are so free that they know themselves, that though it contradicts what might be presented to them, right, they're still able to offer themselves as a gift. So all of that to say, one of the things that I found in my research actually was that there was a woman who wrote a book on, it was called When Sex Goes to School. And she wasn't Christian based. I believe she might have been a sociologist. And she interviewed four different communities throughout the United States about sex. And it was largely, you know, she would get the parents who didn't want their kids to have any information of sex from the school because they were afraid of what they would get from the school. Should have parents that thought, well, the school should be teaching them this, like, let them do it. And the whole gamut. It wasn't just those two things. But she said what she realized by the end of her research was that it wasn't so much that we disagreed about, like, what we typically think, and we're like, it should be done this way or it should be done this way. She's like, what I realize is that we need to just tell children that this is a value, and we need to be clear about what our values are. And depending upon how you define that value is how you're going to respond to it, and how you're going to speak about it, and how you're going to live your life, right, in relation to it. And so I think really that's ultimately what our conversation has been about, Mario, is that modesty is also a value. And it's, to me, it's almost like the value, the ultimate value, right, is charity, is love. And then there's
Right.
it's like a diamond. I mean, I know this is my analogies, but this is what I got. It's like a diamond, and there's facets to the diamond. And one of the facets to the diamond, one of the major facets, like central, is freedom. But it's surrounded by these other facets. And one of those facets would be chastity. One of those facets would be modesty, right? One of those facets would be patience, like whatever it is. And truly, they're so interconnected, right? Because that's what modesty is, me saying I'm patient in love. Like chastity is me saying I'm patient in love, not just in like an action, like I'm waiting till I get married to engage in sexual intercourse, which praise God if that's what you've been able to offer. But even if not, right? Like it's still, it remains a gift where we get to begin again with each day. Like that's what freedom offers us. And we get to learn from our mistakes, and we get to learn from our, not even sins, just things that we're like, ooh, that was weird. Like, ooh, I wish I would have not worn that dress. Like that felt uncomfortable all night. And I don't want to wear something like that again, you know? Or you're like, you know, me. I mean, Mario, there was a phase where I definitely sewed ribbon to the bottom of some of my dresses because someone had told me my dresses were too short. And I'm like,
Oh,
what?
mercy. Okay.
My gosh, my dresses were fine. I mean,
Why?
it
Because
was
you're
like,
so tall?
I'm so tall.
Why? Because you're
It was-
tall? Because you're 5'10"? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, look, it was 1 or 2. It wasn't the end of the world. It actually looked kind of cute, but like tacky and unnecessary, you know? And so I just say like you learn, but I can laugh about it. You know what I'm saying? Because it's like, it also.
Yeah, but I can hear, and I want to honor this, Sarah, just as you've been talking throughout the episode. And I believe me when I say this, that when I asked you into this conversation, I didn't realize that the history that would emerge from this.
Oh, yeah.
And
I
that's
mean,
me being a guy.
No.
And so I can hear
honestly
very
say
clearly your
that,
stories kind of
right.
emerging.
Well, and I think and I'm sharing them because like they don't.
And the hurt that comes from some of this when it becomes,
Yes.
when it becomes too much.
Yes.
on the
And
other
I
side.
don't say this
I
to
hear that. I
say
hear that.
like I only share this, like, I don't think about this. Like, I'm not hurt by this anymore. Like, it's not like something I consider, but I felt like they were relevant because I think a lot of women, when we talk about modesty, that's what they fall back to, is that thing they were told at some point where they felt ashamed of the gift of who they are in their body. And they felt like they needed to cover up in a way that we were not talking. Does that make sense? So that's what, and I can say, truly, like, I laugh at these things now because I'm like, what was I thinking? I didn't need to worry about that, you know? But in that moment, I had to go through that, and I learned a lot from that. And I praise God if you're listening to this, you've never had that struggle. But a lot of my friends, we all went through these phases where we had to learn, not based on what someone else is always telling us, because it truly is, it's a part of the personal gift of myself, and my body is unique. And so again, I don't say this with like any like, I'm not worried about it. Like, I'm not like hurt anymore, but it was at that time when you're 20. So for the girls, if anyone's listening to it and you're still impressionable, I want you to give yourself space and time to really discern like the voices coming in that are telling you. And if they just don't sit right, maybe it's because it's not truth, you know, like truth should ultimately be freeing. And I think that if we're being, now we have to be honest with ourselves. But if we're being honest with ourselves, and I'm being honest about the intentions behind why I'm wearing things or like saying things or doing things, again, like modesty reaches beyond just what we're wearing. I think oftentimes, like, every woman has like capacity, and we know when we need to check ourselves, but we don't have to also be the other extreme where we're so consumed by it that we become a bit scrupulous and we forget that fashion can be fun. You know, like, it's meant to be like, I love, like, in my later 20s, I would say that's when I like found like, oh my gosh, this doesn't really matter as much in an intense way. Like, I get to like be creative. It's like the artistic side of my heart gets to come out by choosing what I get to wear. You know what I'm saying? And like, to me, that's really fun. And there's stuff that I might wear that my husband's like, like, do we sometimes have conversations where I'm like, is this too much? And he's like, maybe not for me, but like for this gala we're about to go to, like, just like, you know, not like you can't wear it, but maybe I'll accent it with something to, you know, tone it. Like, that's just, that's the way that we're creative. But also there are things that I'm like, this is such a cute, this happened recently, this is such a cute shirt. He's like, I don't really like that shirt. And I'm like, I don't really care. I love the shirt. I'm going to wear it. Like, it's fine. Yeah. And like, that's healthy. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's the beauty and the joy of like, but it's in the context of love is my point, is like a conversation with my husband about what I'm wearing because I'm vowed to him and I've truly chosen to give myself as a gift to him. That's a different conversation than when you're like 22. If some rando's like, hey, you should do or you shouldn't do, you just, it's like everything. We filter through and we offer up to the Lord and we say, Jesus, like, what do you want me to take from this? But it's going to be checked by my formation of my values. And so with your children, it's less of a, oh my gosh, you cannot wear that out the house. Like, I cannot believe you would think to put that on. I taught you better. It's like, wait, calm down for a second. Why does she want to wear it? Like, babe, what are you thinking about? Like, why do you want to wear that? Like, you look so beautiful, but I'm just wondering, like, why do you want to wear that? And then as you get in that conversation, you can say, okay, I understand, but maybe, again, it's like, maybe we can do this with it or do that with it, because I just feel like it may be a lot for this event or whatever that you're going to, that, you know, like it's like giving her the gift of what responsibility is, but then also in the same token, the responsibility for the men, right? Of like, no matter what she's wearing, I will respect you. So
that's right. Yeah. And so like, I only have guys, and those conversations I try to have with them on that side. Cause absolutely. I mean, again, going back to the cruise, I mean, just I remember I remember we were like in one of the slides, like waiting, like to go, and it's cause it's a cruise, the staircase is like tight spiral going up to like get up to like the water slide or whatever. And I'm with my 8-year-old son at the time. And the woman in front of me, literally her rear was like right in my face because of the slide. Right?
So
like,
sorry.
and because everybody's wearing string bikinis, right? She was too, and it was like, and
I know. You're like,
it's so. I just laugh. I'm just laughing at this because it's funny. It's literally like literally like right there, like her butt's like right there.
Right?
Like,
yeah. You're like,
and I'm trying to be like, hey, bud, like. Yeah, so it's like, so what do I tell him to look at? You know, it's like, and he has to be trained, of course, in chastity, and absolutely, I'm not blaming. I want to be clear about that. Like, he can't, you know, but it is hard. You know, it's like, all right, well, let's just talk about. I don't know what I was trying to talk about. You know,
great slide.
Because the obvious is there, right? And so, like, that's the place where, again, I reiterate, or another example is, I mean, Chris and I, we went out to eat recently to celebrate our anniversary, and we went to the mountains in Western North Carolina, which, of course, you know, some of the mountain communities tend to lean a little bit more, you know, on the liberal side of things. And we went and got a cup of coffee at a restaurant, and the waitress was wearing a very tight shirt and very sheer also, and she was not wearing a bra. And it was very obvious, you know, and so I'm just trying to like look her in the eye, respect her personhood, you know, as I'm trying to just order a cup of coffee, you know. But this is some of it's like the reality is like, well, so I'm like, she would probably just say, well, I'm the prude, you know, and I just need to get over it. Absolutely. Because that's the standard, you know. And I'm like, yes, I need to respect you as a person. Yes, you want to have your freedom and you just want to let your girls out or something. I don't know, like, but at the same time, you know, is it like where's relationship? How does relationship form, you know, in this, where it's like, how do we engage when somebody just says, just get over it, you know, like, if you start from the standpoint, just says, just get over it, like, it's your fault. Well, like that doesn't, and I'm not saying that's what she was doing. I mean,
no, I know you're not.
Again, just respecting
I don't
her freedom.
think you are. I think
but like, that's the
saying,
point, that it's like, it's just hard.
Well, what you're talking, I remember Dr. Jacobs, the philosophy professor that I just love. We had him. He used to say, you know, it's really hard to dialogue if you can't agree on first principles, you know, and so you got to find like common ground. So if someone's like, well, just get over it, you know, and I think it comes back to that education piece. And again, that word value, I just keep thinking about that, because in my work with consultations, for example, a lot of questions come up related to sexual ethics, like what is ethically permissible in the eyes of the church within the marital act. And look, that's a wide gamut, because just different experiences, the number of consults I'm getting, and different people in different walks of life. And I think in a basic way, this is always in a sense, not because people aren't capable of going higher, but it's almost like if we can't explain it to a third grader, then like we're maybe overcomplicating it. Do you know what I'm saying? It's So it's like just going back to the basics. It's like,
the basics.
Okay,
absolutely.
So what I would talk about with my girls, you know, is like, let's talk about the parts of the body that I'm trying to veil. At my minimum, if I'm at the beach, which, you know, on the cruise, still a minimum, but something, right? And it's like, clearly a minimum. There's very little, very minimum. There was a very little minimum. It's ironic, like how expensive those minimum pieces of clothing are. But anyway, I don't understand. Anyway.
That's just.
But
exactly.
you know,
that's another conversation.
Yeah, whole other conversation. But the value of like, and I'm just going to go there right now because this is how we talk, right? But
Sure.
in educating my children, right, and this is for the parents to hear, use the terms like it doesn't have to be
Yes.
hijacked by the culture. So like a woman has breasts, she has a vagina, a young man has a penis.
Right.
These are parts of our body.
Yep.
They are good,
Yep.
right? And even when you're teaching like men are going to make jokes, okay, locker room talk, whatever. Okay, but like if you're around a young woman, like there's a way you're respecting her, and hopefully when you're not around her, you're respecting her in your conversation, right? But then what are those, like John Paul II's point is that when he talks about understanding the psychology of man, we have to talk about that what you said from the beginning, Mara, which is really the point that we're like coming back to, is that the body has a sexual value to it. So when someone says get over it, in some sense, it's a denial of we belong to each other. Our bodies are not just biologically reactions of whatever, right? Not biological reactions to stimuli. They have a value to them that is also sexual because I'm made for communion. And that's always spiritual. We're all called to spiritual communion. And sometimes for a lot of people, that's also physical. But then how I present myself to those around me that I belong to and they belong to me, am I respecting them and just the basics of their creation? And look, I gave a talk 3 weeks ago, for New Horizons with Echo Community. And I was speaking on sexuality. And I remember I just felt very convicted for that presentation to share, you know, that especially for the men in the room, I really explained, because the distinctions between lust and love, right? And I really want to explain for the men, but also for the women, like things happen to our bodies and our bodies respond. So like, again, I'm just being really blunt here, but like a man is going to experience an erection, honestly, in response to things. I'm like, I wouldn't even have noticed that or thought of that. But like, this is how God wired man. That is not bad or evil. It's what do we do in response to it? But in a sense, he's literally responding to, in some part of him, it's connected to the sexual value of woman, even if it's not a woman. You know what I'm saying? It's like so many things come into your head. But then as a woman too, it's like, I'm responding to the sexual value of man. Now that attraction and that response, I find it kind of like part of God's humor, and that it's like, it's different for men and women. I don't mean like libido, like that depends on the person. Like sometimes, you know, but I just mean like, I find it sort of, I think it's just part of God's divine humor, like that he created us as we did, and that literally the parts fit together. But at the same time, it's like you're constantly discovering each other anew. Like that's the beauty of purity, right? And the beauty of modesty. It isn't to take away from the gift or to take away from the fun or like the joy, but it's the difference between what I've seen, like when we figure it out and we're like, okay, I think I'm in a place of a healthy modesty. Like I'm not at one extreme where it's just everything goes. I'm not at the other extreme where it's like I have to hide everything. Like you can wear, like JP2 literally says that you should not doubt if she's a woman. Like you should be able to tell she's a woman. That's like, okay. You know, I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but I think that's important, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be like sometimes it's a style and you're more comfortable in it. You know, maybe you just had a baby and you're like, I'm in here for tunic dresses. I'm like, great. You know, but sometimes you're like, I want to wear something more form fitting. Great. Like, and you have to be honest with yourself and what you're comfortable with. And that's good. Like all of that's good. But I think what I'm trying to say is that the point of John Paul II in this conversation is that modesty can only be understood within the context of that our bodies, we are sexual creatures, and these parts of my body as a woman have a sexual value to them, you know, and the parts of a man's body have a sexual value to them. And it's like, we're learning how to understand that and understand that it cannot be disconnected
that sexual
from that
value
it's gift.
That's right. That's it. That the sexual value, and that's the key. Okay. And I think this is something you said is kind of light bulb. Is that's the key, is that at the end of the day that the sexual value is primarily gift, and it is spousal in nature. It's meant to be for gift, but that the gift is always being communicated. And so if we again just reduce sex to it just not being about gift, but it about being my pleasure, even if my pleasure is in the context of you having pleasure too, but it's still mutual usury, the sense that like, I'm having pleasure, you're having pleasure, we're having a great time. Like we both consent to it, but we're both just primarily motivated about my response to this act rather than this being a gift of self to the other person. it's in that context then that I think that's the answer. It's like, well, then if that's the case, well then, yeah, like that woman who was serving me coffee that wasn't wearing a bra, and it's like, it's not that she's seeing that as a gift in the sense of like we're meant to preserve or to love one another. It's like, well, this is just what it is. And so everybody else kind of get out of the way. Like, it doesn't matter. Social norms be damned. It doesn't matter.
Because it's my body.
I should just have the freedom.
And
it's
I'm
my
free
body.
To do with
I have
it
the
what I want.
And I'm free to do with it what I want. That's right. And nobody should tell me otherwise. And it's like, and if you start from that place, then they're like relationship, you have an obstacle barrier to relationship right out of the gates, right out of the gates. Yeah. Again, if we're speaking about relationship in the genuine sense of it, not just in this, well, whatever, usury kind of context of it that we've kind of reduced it to.
Yeah.
And so part of reality, and I wanted to say this earlier, is also just acknowledging, again, not out of fear, but acknowledging that, and this is what John Paul II does beautifully in the Theology of the Body, is that concupiscence is part of reality now. Like, that's just part of what we have to kind of accept. That when I walk into a room and I see that chocolate cake, there's a part of me that wants to eat the whole freaking thing, Now, yourself, if you can't be in a room with chocolate cake, then don't be in the room with chocolate cake. But if you can be in the room with chocolate cake and you can see it and you can acknowledge for what it is and feel the pull and have a sense of ability to work with that, then great. Then you have some freedom over that. But that pull, like, is going to be there. And I think sometimes when we fall into scrupulosity, we even judge ourselves for even having that pull. It's like the pull is what it is, people. Like, it happens
to you. It's not what you do with it, which is distinction.
Exactly. Distinction. That's exactly right. That's exactly the distinction.
And I think that is ironic to use this word again. It's a very freeing distinction because freedom can only be lived within the limits of reality. Reality is that God made you to respond to the good. So you're responding to the goods.
So I'll speak to the guys here, because when the whole episode thus far has really been speaking to women in modesty, but to the men also, like, this is a great advice that I'd heard from a priest, and he was speaking to seminarians specifically, with Father Rafferty, and he said to men at IPF, he said, like, so often we're trained just to, like, as soon as you see a woman, wherever your eyes caught, like, you close your eyes and you turn away. And he said the problem with that is that because you're so quick to be attracted to her, whatever gets ingrained into your mind is the thing that you just shut your eyes at. And so you just close your eyes, and all of a sudden it's that body part that you just saw that you felt some fear, some arousal or attraction towards. Like, now you've closed your eyes, and so now you've ingrained that. That's the last thing you see, and that's what's, like, in your mind. He says, rather, just, if you can, again, everybody know thyself, but take a second and actually, like, look at another part of her body that actually reminds you that she's a person.
Right. And
if you can see another part of her body that reminds you of that she's a person, then you close your eyes, or then you avert it. It's at that point that you have to work against that pull to objectify. You have to work against that pull to be able to then see her as a person. And this is where, again, where we help each other out. We've been speaking the whole time about a both and in this, where men absolutely need to be able to work through those impulses to not objectify women. But women knowing also man's biology and recognizing that, the parts of a male brain that lights up is different when he sees a picture of a woman that's scantily clad versus a picture of a woman that's right, modestly dressed. And even the way that man thinks about like, he sees a woman that's scantily clad and is thinking more about, like, what I want and how I want to take and what I want, and viewing it more as like a gadget, or the same parts of the brain that light up with a red heart Ferrari or something like that. It's that sense of desire that's there, lust in that sense. But then the modesty dressed image, it's more like, well, I can see her as a person a little bit more. Again, men have to do the work that when they see a woman, not to be able to objectify her, absolutely. But just a little bit of education can help a woman also say, well, again, what is the attention, or what do I? Again, I always hate saying that because I'm not blaming any. I don't want to come across as saying, like,
No, I think you're educating. That's what you just said about men speaking to them is good for women to hear.
Yes.
I don't think like that. I'm not like, I'm just built differently. So I'm like, that's what he means by the education on the psychology. It needs to be a mutual conversation, you know, and both are responsible. You've made that very clear. I think we've both, I hope everyone has heard that because we keep saying it, but when I'm in the,
so when I'm in the slide line, it's really hard for me to see you as a woman when all I'm seeing is your rear in my face.
Well, and
that's
my husband
just the reality. That's just the reality.
That some of the guys come to him and they're like, Mr. Lorio, like, it's just hard. Like these girls, you know, and it's hard on the same. I used to look, I coached track and we would be at, and I don't think I'm pulling the veil back on anybody because this is like every high school in the world. This would happen. The girls come out to stretch. I told them not to wear short shorts, like dumb shorts that I'm like, you don't need that to run in. They go over to stretch. Some of the boys come after school. They're not on the track team. They just want to watch the girls stretch. And so like me and the other coach are like, we're actually going to go on that side of the track and I'm going to stand. But they're 16, 17 years old. I'm telling you that's how the boys are going to act. I'm telling you the girls, they don't, some of them are just not in a place to see or accept how we have been able to explain it. And I think they will get there. But it doesn't mean we stop offering them that vision. Do you know what I'm saying? Like that there is responsibility that is really important also on the woman. And yet, like you've been emphasizing and I've been emphasizing, unlike what my sweet friends and I, thank God we were able to talk to each other about it. But like one of my friends said, she still we talked about this last week. She's like, I still remember being at the beach and just like how we talked about modesty all the time at the beach. Like, so our group was a bit more scrupulous, you know, obviously based on some of the stories I've told you, but it's like either whether it's that or the other extreme, we still haven't reached that happy medium. And what you're saying is like, keep offering the education. The responsibility is for the women, but the responsibility becomes more clear when I understand how the man's mind works. And then the man, the responsibility is on him as well. But like you just described, Mario, like, I'm sorry I keep laughing, but I'm like, I don't know what else you're supposed to do. You're like, thank you, Lord, for the gift of beauty. And you're like, she's still here. Like, God bless her.
I don't know what else I'm supposed to do.
Down the slide, you know, like someone let her cut in line, but all of you are wearing this. So I don't know what else to, you know, and like, I do want to say too, what I think is so beautiful too, is like, I've also seen the other extreme where people then, they don't go outside anymore because they're afraid of like, you know, and I'm like, no, we need to be, it's like the beauty is that you're on the cruise and your boys are showing up as
we had a great
young
time.
men and you and your sister, right? It was your sister. Y'all are having a great conversation where you don't agree on everything. It's like, it's all good. Like that's all as it should be, is that we keep engaging because the values, I think there's always a pendulum. So it's swinging and it's swung. You know what I'm saying? Like it's coming back and it's just, it's doing its thing, but there is hope. There's a lot of hope. There's a lot of hope.
Well, that's where the medium is. And that's where I've always wanted this podcast to land. Yeah. And this is where we're going to land it today, is that because in our polarized society, what we find is not so much that I think that the pendulum is swinging. It's actually, I think that we have two pendulums that are stuck in opposite directions from one another.
That's a good way to put it. It's a really good way to put it.
And so we're seeing, as polarization happens, we're seeing very distinctly one community going more in one direction and another community going in another direction.
It's very well said.
And Catholic voices have to maintain the middle. Like this is, and I mean that sincerely. Like this is what the church has always wanted us to be.
Well,
is to find virtue in the teachings.
Yes.
And to not pull to extremes, because that is not what the church has communicated in any form or fashion.
It hasn't. And I went into this on a bit of a diatribe last podcast, so everyone listen to that one where I had more time to do it, but it does relate then to the deep intimacy between the spouses, right? Of like, it's not supposed to be this extreme of control or it's almost like, think of it in my opinion, it's like the church has these teachings as an invitation for us. Within the teachings, it's a playful playground. The sexual act is a playful playground, you know, like within the reason of, if to the pure all things are pure. Like if I see you as a gift and I offer myself as a gift, then like I don't need to be afraid. I also don't need to command or like demand and especially like the husbands to the wives or the wives to the husbands. Like if you're a woman, I just want to say this since we're talking about dress them, but like if you're a woman who loves to wear dresses all the time, like awesome, wear them all the time. Yeah. And if you don't, that's awesome. Like it doesn't honestly matter. Your femininity
Right.
is not so superficial that it's determined by that. Does that make sense? Like I just think
Right.
that's relevant because I think in one of those extremes,
That's right.
it's
Well, that's
come
why we
out.
haven't really even gone into any of that, like
Yeah, yeah. So just like take everything we're saying. I think you can follow to those conclusions, but it's just
but make your own conclusions on it, because John Paul II doesn't either, and I've always made that clear. It's not
there's a freedom, right? It's just it's a
there's a
playful freedom of creativity, and each woman is unique, and praise God for that. But within the marriage, right, it comes to that mutual submission and respect, and so it all of these facets, like I talked about the diamond, they're all connected. But again, it's not you're not like stuck.
But to the blessed, so the blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. I mean, like that's the answer. Is that the answer to? And this is what John Paul II says, is that the answer is then you do the long and arduous work of actually sifting out within your heart what's there. And again, that's the claim of society is just that you just say, well, it's shame. You throw off shame, throw off the social standards, and then you just march on, woman, and do whatever the heck you want. It's like, that's not going to lead to virtue. Okay, so let's just put it out there. All right. But then the other extreme is like, well, we just wrap it all up, and then we just live in fear of one another. Well, that's not going to lead to virtue either.
Yeah.
Okay. So somewhere in the middle is that we choose then, as you said, to play, and we give ourselves permission to actually try. And we give ourselves permission to actually learn, because the task is before us to actually engage with our heart so that we get to a point that we can, in fact, see God, and then we can see him in all things. And that process is not an easy one, and it's not a short one either. It's one that takes a long time. And so we do that within our own hearts and minds, but then we also do that in the context of a relationship, as you've said. So now I'm learning how God operates within my life, how to grow in purity with myself. As a married man, that also means I've committed myself to discovering ever anew the gift of my spouse, and always seeing her and recognizing that there's a target that we're trying to get to that we never quite get to, but we're still going to aim and keep going towards it. Mm-hmm. And that we choose purity, not out of fear, but out of freedom,
That is the key. Purity, not out of fear, but out of freedom. That is where the hope is because they can coexist. They do coexist. And I believe it all connects back to each other. Like that's where the Lord leads us back to himself, because it's a place to rest. And if I can add this quote to kind of confirm what you just said from John Paul II, of course. But he said, "Do not be dismayed if love sometimes follows tortuous ways. Grace has the power to make straight the paths of human love." It's a journey, but with grace, we learn, we take each day as it comes. We can grow in our own understanding of this value of modesty, this value of chastity, this value of freedom, this value of love. And then, like you said, we become more ourselves because we possess ourselves more, and then we can give a fuller gift of self. And that's where truly John Paul II was inviting Margaret Singer, is Margaret, don't stop there. There's so much more. And I think that's what his words to women all these years have been, and I just want to say, I personally feel like we're in the last 10-ish years, we're starting to get a bit further away from John Paul II. Like we've forgotten him a bit. Like we've forgotten his story. We've forgotten his works. So I'm getting so excited because at least in my sphere of influence, I feel like, now's the time where we really get to see, I think, this resurgence, especially for the vocation of a woman, of how valuable she is, how he sees her, and how he's like, don't stop short, because your freedom is so important, right? And in honoring your freedom in the essence of what it is, that you are free to be who you are, no matter your vocation, no matter your job status, no matter your relationship status, no matter if you have children or if you don't, if you're married or if you don't, like the world needs something that only you can offer. And now is the time. And so I'm so excited.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about your podcast?
Yeah. So my podcast is called What Women Are. It's based on the Edith Stein quote, the world does not need what women have. It needs what women are. And I think John Paul II was really the foundation of my trusting that the church wanted what was best for me as a woman, and that I didn't have to fit into a box. And so this conversation sort of leads nicely to what the podcast is, which is twofold. Primarily, the idea came from my desire to honor the stories of the women around me who I think are so incredibly gifted. And so the difficulty of the podcast at this point is that I'm a one-woman show, which Mario can attest to. So I'm doing all the things.
Not a woman, but I'm a one-man show.
Of course, objective reality, different. But but there's so many women I know that they don't have time to jump on a podcast or to come to do a podcast studio, which I don't have yet, but maybe one day, because they have things going on in the background. And so my goal is for a lot of these episodes, I'm going to the women and like the villages surrounding them and their moms watching their kids for 2 hours, or their sisters coming over and watching their kids while we're upstairs. And so I feel very convicted about the need to give women a voice, because I think there's so many hidden women, ordinary, everyday women who have such wisdom to offer. And I think part of my role and my hope for this podcast is to give them just this opportunity to speak the truth as they've experienced it, for women around the world to know their value and their dignity, but also to have more encouragement to embrace their one real life as it is in reality, because that's where freedom is. And then the second part of that will be, I will also do some solo episodes that go into my sphere of women's health, hormonal health, integrated sex education, love and responsibility, you know, the fun stuff like the home and whatever. Like, I love that women are so multifaceted, so I'm going to have fun with it. But I would love for everyone to join me on that journey. And I'm so excited to get started. And thank you for letting me highlight that as well, Mario.
Absolutely. Well, we'll have a link to that in the show notes for sure. So, Sarah, I have taken you well beyond my allotted time for you. So thank you for your generosity, giving me some extra space. And
Absolutely.
To all the listeners, this is a very long episode, and I needed space just to think through some things and talk things out. And so thank you for allowing me to meander a little bit. And so to the listeners, thank you for sticking with us to the end of this thing, because this definitely is a long one for sure, a little bit longer than my usual episodes, but I wanted to give us plenty of room to just kind of breathe and duck and weave and move around a little bit.
The beauty of dialogue,
do what
right?
we needed to do.
Yeah, we got to, I'm so grateful. I know Dr. Tom Neal used to always say, like back in the day, I'm going to butcher this, but he would say that they would have these debates, and then it's not like you're debating the other. What they would say when they would come to this end would be, the truth has won, you know, like the truth has had the victory. And so it's together, we have these questions, both Mara and I, we both still have questions, but it's like we get to mull over this thing in a friendship and in authenticity and push back and ask questions. And I'm just so grateful for the opportunity. And so thank you for allowing me, both you, Mario, and the listeners, for allowing me the time to do that.
Amen. And so to the listeners who are listening to this, I just encourage you that if wherever you are on this spectrum of this modesty conversation, that maybe this episode challenged you a little bit one way or the other. If you're somebody who maybe is leaning more towards the scrupulous side, being open to letting some air in, and being open to allowing you to express your beauty in a creative way that is still modest. But if you're somebody who's listening to this and maybe haven't ever heard this before, in terms of like the body being a gift for the other, and that the part of the gift is respect and of the other person, and being challenged maybe a little bit to want to know what and live modestly, then I pray that this episode has found you. And so I'm grateful for everybody who's given me your time, and many blessings to you also. Sarah, God bless you and all the work that you're doing. Thanks again for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.